calm down before you stress up the groove. The energy a little different when the blessings accrue.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, and hello, everybody who may be watching. I'm Serena. I'm the company owner of Serena Consulting, which is a company specializing in strategy, coaching, training solutions for all things leadership, talent, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm joined by my lovely friend and former colleague, Leo Alexander, who is an expert in EDI, has a wealth of experience and insights. And what are we doing? Well, we decided that after a number of conversations that we've had in the last few months, it might be really helpful to record a conversation. So we've called this an honest conversation about race and EDI in the UK. And we hope to spend about 30 minutes discussing our insights, observations over the last few months, particularly surrounding a really tumultuous period in the UK, where we've seen a series of disturbing anti-immigration protests and riots. We'll share some observations, some thoughts, some best practice, but also really importantly, some potential solutions. So before we kick off into all of that good stuff, Leo, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. So, hi, I'm Leo, Leo Alexander Nicholas, for those of you who want to check me out on LinkedIn. I've been working in the EDI field for 14 years now. So, I've seen it all, so to speak. I've worked in various sectors, from local government through to finance, e-commerce, renewables. So, I've, insight in terms of different sectors and what's right, but also a view of the challenges in the EDI space and how, no matter what sector you're in, it's all kind of interconnected, and fundamentally it's about people. So yeah, let's get into it.
Great. Well, it's exciting, and we'll challenge ourselves to try to stick to around 30 minutes, because I think there's a lot we could talk about, and we also do our very best to try to avoid sort of thorny political sort of opinion, but inevitably anything to do with equity, diversity, and inclusion surrounds some of those difficult areas. So it may well come up. But in particular, you and I have talked about what we've seen in the UK over the summer, and also very much in connection as to what reaction or not in some cases from business, industry, and employers. And I think both of us have got some really useful insights into some of those I guess, responses to some of that difficulty, but it's probably worth us just, particularly if you're not from the UK watching this, should we just remind ourselves of sort of what happened? So I guess, in summary and keeping it very sort of high level, what we saw was mostly sort of condensed into England and Northern Ireland between the end of July and August the 5th. Following a really tragic incident in Southport, and that then sparked over 29 anti-immigration demonstrations and riots across 27 towns and cities in the UK. That resulted in racially aggravated attacks, arson, looting, and widespread damage and criminal activity. I guess when we sort of think about that, it's still kind of shocking when you recall it. What are your sort of, as you look back at that period, which doesn't, isn't that far, that didn't happen so long ago, right? But it feels like we're already moving.
I guess, what happened was quite alarming, being honest with you, but not unsurprising,
Yeah.
because I think there's been some underlying tension in relation to immigration, how people of color feel in particular in the UK, and the fact that, race is something as a society we don't necessarily like to talk about. That includes the good and the bad aspects of, being a person of color. And if someone highlights it, it's almost like a backlash of, I don't see color, it's not relevant. So actually, with that, not being able to speak about it, tension brews.
Yeah.
That's where you have a vocal minority who feel bolstered by the silence to act, act violently, act, racially discriminatory, and fundamentally, alienate a group of people in British society who've contributed, to this country, and continue to contribute to this country's wealth and prosperity. And it's a shame it happened, but I think for many, it's again not a surprise because we don't talk about it, but you feel that tension when you walk out on the street or you go to the shops. So yeah, that's reality.
Yeah. It is. And I think you're absolutely right to point out that this sort of explosion felt like it had been simmering under the surface. And one of the things that I've been sort of pondering around is the fact that what I sense from some of that unrest and these feelings of unfairness and threat to some individuals in the UK, they simply didn't have the language or the channels in order to express themselves in a way that would be more effective, or in a way that may seek better solutions. It feels very much similar to some of the things that we've seen in the US. This polarizing, which we see in mainstream media and of course social media as well, this polarization of, you either have one opinion or the extreme of the other. And what I noticed is that, that in the absence of debate, nuance, and discussion, there creates this sort of strength in being polarized. So either, you're right, you're wrong, you're for, you're against. And I think that sort of build up is what I noticed, feeding into some of the riots that we saw in the summer.
I completely agree with that. And I think it's interesting actually, because I think the majority of people are pro-inclusion, pro-equity, pro-belonging. So what you have are on the right side, so to speak, or on the side of pro-human rights, essentially, is you have leaders of change who are vocal about it and are really progressive and want society to move on and be inclusive. And of course, in the polar opposite to change, you have people who are resistant to it. And these are a minority, but they're a very vocal minority with a lot of power. So what happens is they kind of view the silence of the majority in the middle as a kind of go ahead to have these views against anti-aggression. And that falls in not only with people, but also with companies and, governments, sectors and media. If they are silent, that vocal minority who opposes change will use that as a launch pad to air their views and give them strength. So, there's really a need for that quiet majority, even if it's not necessarily I am pro progression and really I'm with you in all this terminology and where we're going, at least have some form of resistance to those who are anti-change, anti-human rights, anti-inclusion, because that way, you kind of don't bolster their voice. And I think that's the thing that's been missing.
Yeah, and it's a great point, the silent majority, right? And I think we'll definitely come back to that, because I think that's something that particularly with employers and business and organizations, there's a lot to sort of explore in that area and how powerful that can be. So why don't we switch it into some sort of industry specific stuff? So let's think about business, let's think about employers. Leah, let's start with thinking about what our observations were around companies that responded publicly during the riots. Many remained silent. What do you think that says in terms of those that chose to remain silent? And also, I can't help but compare it to other things where we've seen global incidents around Black Lives Matter movement, for example, and, other sort of significant catalytic events where we've seen a lot more statements from organizations and business. What were your observations there in terms of what you saw going out publicly or not?
So I think there's been a massive wall of silence, to be honest. I struggle to name any company that's really put out a public message or, really said something about supporting their employees during this time in the UK in terms of the riots. And I think there's an element of fear because, like I said, this is a vocal minority who, some of them wield quite a bit of power. So as a company, if you're saying you're anti-riots and you're anti what the message is saying, you do not want to put yourself in a position where you're attacked, essentially, be it, through social media or physically, for example. If we think about some of the shops that were looted, for example, Greggs, Shoe Zone, not one company, I don't think, released a message around the riots, right? Because again, they probably didn't want a backlash and then more people to target their stores. So I think publicly, at least, it's felt, I can imagine, quite lonely for particularly people in those communities that have faced this violence, so to speak, and anti-immigration riots against, their existence. So what I would hope is these companies actually internally at least have been highlighting their support mechanisms for their employees and really putting that resource into making sure they feel safe and they ultimately feel like they belong at their company. But at least on the face of it publicly, that wall of silence has been quite telling.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, you referenced Black Lives Matter back in 2020. I think, yes, there was, some real words and people calling out, the disparities that existed and, the violence against George Floyd. But equally, there was a bit of skepticism from many in, the equity, diversity, and inclusion communities and people of color around whether it would be long lasting. And 4 years down the line, we're seeing EDI programs being cut. We're seeing EDI professionals being let go from organizations and a row back of EDI activity. So in some respects, the Black Lives Matter was, that response was great, but I don't think it was sustainable and hearts were in it, so to speak, because, less than a decade, not even half a decade, we're seeing no progress. And in fact, we're going the opposite direction.
Yeah, it's really disappointing because I think some of that skepticism that professionals in this sphere, as you and I are, some of that skepticism has been proved to have been right. That people, in terms of organizational responses, words are great. It's brilliant to take a position, but you can't do that alone. You need to follow it up with meaningful action, and you need to show employees, and you need to make a statement that has something behind it, right? And I found it really interesting to observe, LinkedIn's a great platform to be able to see what people are doing and saying and all of that kind of stuff from a business perspective. There was an absolute absence of companies taking a position to support their employees, to say, what they would or would not stand by. That was a huge gap, and that silence was really unnerving. I noticed an enormous amount of individuals and employees responding on LinkedIn. And, I released a couple of articles to sort of help prompt some of that conversation. I had an amazing amount of responses, but something was really telling about that, which was the number of people that chose to direct message me rather than join the conversation on LinkedIn under the chat. And that says to me there was a lack of safety. And without safety, we can't share that conversation. So that was really interesting. One of the sort of there were two standout things that I noticed in terms of employee responses. One was a meme which really did make me laugh, but it was kind of laugh and then you're not laughing, because it was a picture which sort of showed like a schoolroom with a chalkboard, and it said, written in chalk, "Did you do your EDI homework?" And somebody was challenging organizations around the scaling down and scaling back of the EDI agenda, which essentially has now led to a point where people don't have the words, as we said before, they don't have the language to be able to express themselves. They then get sucked into this polarization. And beyond that, the preparation and the things that we have learned, the lessons we've learned from global activities that have really impacted human beings in businesses, they haven't taken those lessons. And so the scaling down, scaling back, or removal entirely of EDI and functions within organizations has led to this silence. And I thought that was really, really powerful. But I guess I take heart from the fact that whilst we didn't have a dominance of companies coming out with big statements, I definitely saw a rise of empowered employees challenging businesses. And I think, I take some comfort from that, because it really shows that, you know, you don't need to be in our field to be an advocate for equity, diversity and inclusion, because frankly, it's just part of being a human being. Yeah.
I agree with that. And I think it's fundamentally the right to belong is a human right, right to feel included, to feel empowered, to feel part of a bigger drive, be it in society or in your organization. Is just a fundamental human right. And I think the more that we distance EDI from a political position and more to actually is fundamentally about how we all want to be treated as individuals, be in whatever context, work, family life, going to the shops, you know, taking a commute, or how you're viewed in society. That's a fundamental human right, and that's what EDI is about. The more that we align it to that, I think the more people actually feel more comfortable with it and actually begin to understand that it isn't necessarily a viewpoint, but it's actually about how we feel as individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I had a magic wand, there's lots of things I would do, but one of them would categorically be to move the EDI conversation away from what mainstream media, social media tries to get it into all the time, which is toilets, you know, and pronouns, you know, and boiling a subject which is essentially about a human right to belong, boiling that down into gender neutral toilets or pronouns and getting angry about those things is just so deeply unhelpful and so wildly inaccurate. So let's continue then with a bit of a focus then around what was the impact on employees. What was it then during the worst of what we saw, really condensed into one sort of week where we saw some really horrific scenes? What was the impact on employees and what is it now?
So it's quite broad, actually. I'll say the impact. I think in general, employees will probably feel, you know, the safety is gone, aspect of safety, particularly if you're a person of color, feeling vulnerable just leaving the house, doing day-to-day activities because you're, you know, fear of reprisal just because of how you look. But at the same time, for others, it could be a case of status quo. If nothing's really changed, to be honest. I already feel like this, and this time I just have to be a bit more alert. So I think there's quite, you know, two basically impacts of people who are impacted as a result of the riots. But fundamentally, you know, that lack of safety will translate into business and work, right? Because if you're thinking about how can I commute to the office safely? How can I get home safely? What about my friends, families, relatives? Are you going to be performing at work? Are you going to be able to put your mind fully at work? So for me, it's kind of like what were organizations doing to support employees who felt that vulnerability? Were they given time off, you know, flexible working arrangements so that they didn't have to commute in past these riots? What was it basically? Was it time off for those who had family or, you know, young kids who didn't want them going to school, for example? You know, or I think it was the school holidays, but, you know, going to school at holiday activities essentially, or going out with friends and having to stay home with them. Like, what was the response there? And that for me is the interesting piece. Because that's something that I haven't seen necessarily. I've seen a few articles from employees saying their line managers have been very supportive, but what were organisations doing as a blanket policy for UK employees impacted?
Yeah. And I think you've touched on so many important things there. You know, the lack of safety. You know, if you play that through, if your safety, which is a sort of you know, foundation requirement for us to be able to get on and live our lives. If your safety is threatened, then so is your trust in an organization and its people, and most importantly its leaders. If your safety is challenged, your trust and your ability to sort of believe in and stay loyal to an organization is also threatened. And I think that piece is missing from business. You know, I don't think there is a direct correlation from a lot of leaders that, you know, perhaps had so much anxiety about what to say or not to say, they chose to say nothing without realizing that silence, as we talked about before, their fear led to silence, which took away someone's safety. And that ultimately will not lead to engaged, loyal retention of employees, you know. I think there was something else that you mentioned there, which was the consideration of your day-to-day activity, having to suddenly question, can I get on the train this morning because of my identity, because of my skin color? Am I now able to commute without thinking about anything else? And I think for a lot of people, the answer was no. And having to guess or second guess. And as you quite rightly said, Leo, for many people, that's been the case anyway. Depending on where you live, what your environment is, you know, all of those other factors. For lots of people, they've always had to triple guess what they're doing because of who they are and their identity. But that then became even more heightened, I guess, or maybe not.
I think for me, an example is Islamophobia in the UK. You know, it exists. And, you know, even if we go back, I wouldn't say almost a decade ago, you know, I remember reading and hearing from individuals who, you know, wear hijab, for example, and felt attacked in the street, and, you know, people were trying to remove it, or, you know, other violent acts against them. So would that have changed during the riot, that view and that lack of safety? No, of course not, because that's existed. But I think what this really highlighted and kind of almost forced a lot of individuals to see was the fact that this exists, and it isn't just coming from these individuals, you know, who are you know, that viewpoint of you're bringing up race just to make up an issue, or, you know, to get a race, you're playing a race card. But actually, when it's happening to you, when it's happening and it's viewable on media, TV, people are talking about it, you cannot deny that it exists. So I think, if anything, it's kind of given people who have been impacted by this validation, and also almost kind of like, I don't need to talk about it anymore and say it happens because you've seen it now. But on the flip side, many people didn't actually call it what it was, which wasn't just riots, anti-immigration protests. It was fundamentally racism at play. And I think there was a fear to actually call it that. And, you know, in some viewpoints, I think some people, and I think I was reading about some experts from policing who were calling it almost terrorism. In terms of like what they were doing, they're trying to instill terror for a group of people, right? And that's textbook kind of definition of it, right?
Was terrorism.
But yet that was lacking in terms of the rhetoric. And then also, if it's been labeled as such, that almost kind of gives companies a platform to actually call out the behavior finally, because, you know, it's actually been called something that's anti-society, anti-progression, anti-human rights, so to speak. So it's just a mixed bag, really, for me. Because in some ways it's kind of like people feel less safe, but others it's almost kind of validation that the safety they haven't been feeling for years is actually visible to all. So as most things in, you know, the EDI space, highly complicated, very different viewpoints, but ultimately, you know, I think it's a turning point for us to learn from this.
Words matter. Words really matter. And when I said we wouldn't go into politics, but I can't help it. You know, when Keir Starmer described the actions of some individuals who attempted to set fire to a hotel that was housing immigrants, they called it thuggery. That, you know, and I was so outraged by that choice of language. You know, it was not thuggery, that was terrorism. And if you look up the definition of terrorism, that action, those actions fit the bill. So, you know, words matter. And you also talked to something else that I think is super important as well. You know, leaders go first. This is a fundamental leadership principle. If you are a leader, whether that is a senior politician or a leader of a company or a leader of a team, anybody in a leadership position, if you want to enable things to change, you go first. It is the most fundamental leadership principle. So if you want your team to trust each other more, you have to be the one that goes first and shows vulnerability, and that there's no negative repercussions by saying, I don't know how to do something, or I'm feeling unsure about this. if you say it, others will follow. And that is just one of the most fundamental principles. So I think, you know, that some of that silence, when we go back to that, it's so disappointing, but it's also people forgetting the importance of leadership. Somebody very close to me, you know, during the worst of this said, nobody's asked if I'm all right.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's astounding. She's British born, Indian heritage. Because of her identity and her skin color, she was fearful leaving the house. She went through all of those things that we've just talked about. But in terms of her day-to-day life, nobody said, gosh, are you all right? You know, and that in itself speaks volumes.
And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of leadership and actually, you know, not necessarily having the answers, but actually asking that question.
Yeah.
You know, I've seen what's happened. It's awful. How can I support you? Are
Yeah.
you okay?
Yeah.
That in itself is gold dust to
Yeah.
employees and to
Yeah.
people fundamentally, showing
Yeah.
care and actually, you know, insight and wanting to know about someone's well-being in itself is a response and isn't silence.
Yeah.
And even that, as a company, you know, if I don't necessarily want to, you know, highlight the fact that, well, I don't want the writers, for example, to target my company, fair enough. I don't want to put out a massive political statement, but even a statement of, we're aware of the activities and, you know, the riots taking place in the UK, and we want all our employees and people who use our business to know we're here for you.
Yeah.
Right? That in itself is powerful,
Yeah.
and without actually
you don't need the
go through the murky
answers.
water of the politics.
Yeah.
But just saying we're here to listen, we're here to
Yeah.
help you, and
Yeah.
you know, that is what people need fundamentally, because we're not looking for you all the answers from you, because, you know, fundamentally you may not be the right people to provide the answers, but at the same time we want to see care, and we want to see that you want to create a sense of belonging, and that you ultimately are including us. And I say us, not necessarily, you know, people of color, but more broadly, you know, the employee base or the people base or the public base, us in that sense.
Yeah. It's when we say it like that, you kind of it fills me with disbelief sometimes that something as simple as just saying, you know, I don't know what the answers are, but I really care about how people feel. You know, that is just,
or even just tell us how we can help you in this situation, because we may not have answers, but we want to listen and see what we can do. That's the power, right?
Really powerful. Well, let's stick with that power and go into, because anybody watching this conversation, I'm sure will be wondering, what actions, what things can we do, what are the solutions out there? So I think when we were chatting about how we might do this, let's try and break it into its sort of component parts. So first of all, starting with the individual, you know, let's start there. So in terms of moving EDI back into a position where it's sort of playing a vital role and being able to sort of utilize those human fundamentals, what from your perspective, Leo, do you think individuals who may not have direct decision-making power, what things can they do? What things, actions, potential solutions would you see there?
I think there's several mechanisms, as you know, individuals, and we're talking in the context of, you know, organizations, right? So employees who may not be the execs or exco level, or, you know, the senior directors that can make the decisions, but ultimately are part of that collective impacted, right? I think the first starting point is ERGs. They are not necessarily just a place for activities and awareness events. And I think we need to
just say what an ERG is, just in case. Employee resource group.
Staff networks, or some people call them staff networks. So, you know, your Pride network, your gender network, or your women's network, your disability network. So all kind of important kind of engagement mechanisms in organization, particularly for people of communities who want to create a sense of belonging and give them a voice. And actually, in many organizations, there's been a kind of view of these ERGs are just there for events. So, you know, Black History Month's coming, so the ERG will host the event. But actually, the power of ERGs is that collective voice and providing insight to leaders. So actually, if as an individual you may not be in a position of power, using your ERG to highlight those disparities, how you're feeling, and how the business can support you is a powerful mechanism and tool. So I would honestly say it's an opportunity now for people to pivot those ERGs to be that employee voice in the business and really, spur action. And if you can get a senior champion at that executive level or, board level to really kind of listen to you and actually champion your viewpoints and also put it into that broader plan for employees. So that's my first step, I think, for, individuals. And then, of course, there's standard mechanisms as well. If you feel safe, providing feedback and insight to your line managers or through that chain. And then, speaking to, your HR business partner, particularly if it's like how you're impacted and if you feel you can't go to your manager. There are different routes available in terms of many organizations around airing your views and how you feel as a result of, what's been going on in the UK. And I really suggest people use them.
Yeah.
The ERG is a great place for us.
Great, absolutely. And thank you also for saying the sort of defining factor. An employee resource group isn't just about having a Black History Month party in the canteen. It's much more powerful than that. And I've certainly had experience of, employee resource groups being fundamental to change. So approaching an ERG with a bit of a business mindset, right? So how, what are the things that you notice, first of all, that you think could be better? What are the things that are not provided for you and people, that you identify with, your community? What are those sort of key components? And then if they were improved, what impact on the business would that have? And it's not a very far, I think sometimes there's a belief that it's a bit of a stretch. If I point this out, can I make that a business outcome? Well, absolutely you can. If I come back to our point earlier, Leo, when we talked about, employee retention being a key thing that businesses really want to ensure that they get good people, the right talent at the right time, who have good careers with opportunities for progression. And if that's something you're not seeing, then if you improve that, you're much more likely to stay.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, businesses don't want to lose good talent, right? And the best talent, good talent, talent that delivers for them, that's a waste of money and ultimately impacts your bottom line. So if we're thinking fundamentally about what a business is, it's about growth and, having a good bottom line and growing, right? So I think it almost kind of lends into, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but what employees and organizations can do. And I think there is an aspect of viewing ERGs as a good resource to use and tap into business-wise, particularly in the people and talent space. So I think there's almost kind of mindset shift, particularly for us in the HRBP or HR field, to actually not necessarily see ERGs as either that critical friend that always has criticisms, in terms of what we're doing, or this just awareness event, which I touched upon earlier, kind of bastion of, oh, Pride's coming up, that's what they do. But actually seeing them as a real kind of engagement and tool for understanding insight around lived experiences and impacts of our policies and where we're going and our people plans. So I think that is one of the first things an employees can do, organizations can do, is that viewpoint of ERG seen a bit more strategically. But on the flip side, ERGs really need to buy into growth and development and, really, if there's resource available for their development, take it and really kind of make sure you have a business head on as well as a kind of employee kind of engagement aspect to it as well.
Yeah, so many thoughts about that. And I think just very quickly, I remembered what I think one of the best senior sponsors for an ERG in a previous organisation I won't name, even though it's a compliment, I probably shouldn't do that. But this individual was on the board and quite nervous. They were asked to be the senior sponsor for the employee resource group for race and ethnicity, and they themselves were white. And they had a huge amount of nervousness and anxiety about it and felt that they didn't represent the cause, etc., etc. However, what they did intuitively was just listen. And because they are exceptionally gifted at what they do, which is why they were a board director, they're very good at their job. One thing they're really good at is listening to a problem, breaking it down into its component parts, thinking about what potential solutions and resolutions there might be, and engaging other people. I mean, it's just that's what that he was paid to do, applied the same skills. So as a sponsor for an ERG, you don't have to go. It's back to that sort of question, like as a leader, we have to have all the answers. Absolutely, it's the opposite. Have no answers, have none. Just go in and listen.
I think that's exactly it, right? It's about, if you're an ally, it's about listening, advocating, amplifying voices.
Yeah.
And when a time comes for a decision, taking what you've learnt into account and making that decision with a broader view, not only just your view, but the view of those that you've heard from and that insight you've gathered. And that's fundamental to it, right? So if we're talking about senior leaders in organization, those are probably the 4 aspects where I'll say you could have the biggest impact in that EDI or equity, diversity, inclusion space.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And picking someone who's great at their job, who's a good listener, is really all you need. And because we have such disparity in, you know, we still have an issue across the UK and most of the Western world, where we see all power and decision making not equally distributed. We still see a huge dominance of men, a huge dominance of white men, and highly educated, privileged background white men. So therefore, you might be looking up and thinking, well, who there can represent me? But I think back to that point, let's pick somebody who really wants to learn, understand, listen, and apply their business acumen to improve things. So I think that's really good. Let's think then about employers. So this is where the power sits. This is where the money sits. You know, there's lots of different directions businesses can take. What do you think the sort of key solutions are? Where do they lie to make a tangible difference in promoting inclusion?
The fundamental is leadership. And I say leadership, not because, you know, I always get asked this question, you know, do leaders own culture? And I wouldn't say they do. They lead culture, they're custodians of it, but they don't own it. That's all down to employees. But ultimately, you know, people look to their leaders to create an environment where they thrive, basically, or to help foster that environment they thrive. Because I think, again, employees have an arm to create that environment for themselves. But I think as organizations, if you really want to take EDI to that next level and actually embed it, forget your awareness events, forget, you know, this is coming up this month, let's celebrate that, let's get a message out and spend money and throw resource at that. Focus on inclusive leadership. How do your leaders lead, you know, both internally? So, you know, do they have humility, courage, curiosity, but also outwardly? Do they call out, you know, inappropriate behaviors? Do they actually actively learn? Do they listen? And do they advocate for, you know, people from all different backgrounds on behalf of them? That's fundamentally the starting point for many employers, is actually, you know, focus on your leadership. I think the second aspect is equity. Or, you know, in the United States term, affirmative action. And I think there's been a lot of backlash to this because it's poorly understood. And it isn't a case of putting one group at a disadvantage so you can elevate another. It's recognizing that some groups are not naturally, or I wouldn't say naturally, that's the wrong terminology. I'll say some groups are at a disadvantage, be it systemic wise, societal wise, or for whatever reason. And to enable them to get to access opportunities, they need more support, which is fundamentally, you know, how we view the world, right? We have means testing, for example, as an example of financial support for those who need it most. So not everyone gets the same amount. So I don't understand this backlash to equity in the workplace, because again, if we have this in society in terms of means testing, how we view support to individuals, of course that translates to the workplace, where some groups are naturally going to benefit from systems that exist in the workplace more than others. And those who don't need more resources. And that's equity at hand. But what people have almost translated it into is an anti-white man or kind of viewpoint to equity. And that's not it. It's not saying we're going to cut down opportunities for white men. It's saying they exist already, but others aren't accessing them. So we're going to help them and give them resources so that when those opportunities come up, they're on equal footing. Not more than, not less than, but equal. And that is a real challenge for people. So I think organizations really need to view equity from that point of, we want to give equal opportunities. to
Yeah.
all our employees. We want
Yeah.
our talent to thrive regardless of background. Yes, many organizations say they're meritocracy, but then how does that translate into groups that aren't necessarily being seen for their merit and being seen for other reasons that are a disadvantage to them? How do you remove those biases and barriers? That's
Yeah.
equity. So I
Yeah.
think that for employers and organizations, focus on inclusion, you inclusive leaders, and also focus on equity. And then the diversity will come. You reap the benefits from diversity down the line. Diversity in itself isn't necessarily the target. That for me is an outcome as a result of equity and inclusion. And I think if organizations change that mindset to more of the E and I and the D as an outcome, it'll be great.
I love it. You've described that perfectly. You know, I'm really I always talk about EDI. I remember somebody pointing out that there's another reason, which is, you know, if you have DEI capitalized, for dyslexics, it looks like die, in capital letters. But it's not the right
No,
message.
not what we're trying to do.
But start with equity, because then everything else comes. And those organizations that are going in at the diversity as in the target, actually starting with equity delivers that for you. And when we know so well, when you improve something for one group, it always improves for others. And, you know, things like adjusting maternity leave and paternity leave to parental leave had a massive benefit to men and women, to caregivers, as well as birthing mothers. You know, all people benefited from that change in policy for organizations that have done that. And we see that time and time again. So, you know, I think super important point. When we say let's start with the leaders, and I'm going to get right into, I'm just going to say it how it is. Because I'm quite old, I've been around for a while in businesses when we just picked up what we were calling D&I then, and it was normally just one person. Even in huge corporations, I'm sort of going back, you know, maybe 15, 20 years here, you know, it was one person. They would often come across as like the D&I police, because they were sort of trying to correct what were problematic systems, processes, behaviors, etc. We came from that, and we are where we are today, which is a huge progression in terms of understanding what that is. But, and here's my point, I still see, witness, and have been part of endless rounds of group leadership training on EDI. So we've got a new, let's say, you know, we've got a new perspective, and we've created a EDI strategy for our business. We now need to get that in shape and get everyone behind it. So we start with, let's say, the top 20 most senior leaders in a room together. We launch the strategy, we tell them what it is, we get some training around what is equity, diversity, inclusion, and maybe half a day together, and then we leave. We started this conversation using a term, the silent majority. And that is what I see in those scenarios. So a group of 20 leaders, senior experts in their role, good at what they do, that's why they're in those seats, but none of them feeling equipped in EDI to a level that they maybe are in their technical job. There's a level of anxiety, there's a level of uncertainty, and there is a huge amount of fear, which is understandable because of the polarization that we see in the media, the for and against, and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So I feel that as somebody who often delivers this training, designs this training, that kind of thing. And then what I tend to see very often is a kind of split in that group of 20. So maybe a sort of 1% that are at the top who feel very confident in their opinions, their knowledge and understanding around EDI, and they want to demonstrate that, and they want to get behind it and drive change. And then I see a very disgruntled bottom 1%, for want of a better expression, who will call that woke. and will vocally object to the strategy that's being proposed. And they'll say things, perhaps, if there's a gender of ambition in there, they might say, well, what about the men? That kind of stuff. And they'll vocalize that. Everybody else is the silent majority. And I see this time and time again. And I think there is a place for group leadership coming together on this subject. But I genuinely believe that a better use of time is investing in individual, one-to-one, EDI specific coaching for leaders. Put them in a safe space where their fear isn't the strongest emotion, where they can say what they want to say, they can ask questions, they can say, I'm confused, I really don't get it, or I'm really anti this and this is how I feel. And then they can also learn to identify around the core thing that you said earlier, Leo, which is that sense of safety and belonging. And actually, every single human being on the planet has experienced at some point not belonging and how that feels. So you can educate people in a safe way. What do you think can change in organizations for them to, that kind of group leadership experience that we still see out there? What needs to shift and change in organizations' mindsets here?
So fundamentally is how we view leadership and how we actually assess it and how we actually recognize leadership skills. So for an organization, if someone has great, amazing technical skills, exemplar, etc., does it mean they're a leader? And for me, that's a case of actually maybe not. Do they demonstrate the, leadership qualities? Are they inclusive? Are they, well, they may not be inclusive, but they may understand the awareness and the need of inclusivity. Are they inquisitive? Do they motivate people in the right way? Do they exhibit your values and behaviors to the core? And if they do, those are your good leaders, right? So as an organization, first and foremost, before you even think about, getting training, resources and development for your leaders, how do you identify them and how do you make sure your employee base knows what a good leader is?
Yeah.
That's a fundamental starting step for me. And then, in terms of development for leaders, I think there's a time and place for group learning in EDI or in general around leadership. And I think that's fundamentally around concepts and theory, right? That's something you can come together as a group and, go through. So for example, our new values and behaviors are launched. Let's have a session where we can mind map, have a discussion and begin to understand how we can make it tangible as leaders. That's a great group session. But if it's a session around actually what is inclusivity, what's the right terminology, and how do you exhibit it as a leader, that's a real big unknown for most leaders or a lot of leaders. And actually with that comes a bit of vulnerability and a bit of recognition that they're not going to be the experts in this space. So having it in a group setting, is that the right way? No, because many people do not necessarily want to be vulnerable amongst their peers in the group setting. There's that whole peer pressure aspect and all of that. So for me, it's around development and how organizations view leadership development. If as an organization you see it as important, do you have that resource to actually give leaders one-to-one coaching? If not necessarily one-to-one coaching, do you have resource to actually add them into programs that have an individualized section? So it may have a group training session for a day, but at least an hour's coaching perhaps, off the back of that. What are those mechanisms there and do they exist? That for me is fundamentally around how we support our leaders. So I think there's a room for both, but actually, we cannot forget the importance of that one-to-one session.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And, 100% there, particularly if you're trying to get a group cohesion around a particular part of a strategy, group learning, group sessions, brainstorming together, all of those things absolutely stack up, but on their own, never are enough. And so, what we tend to then see, let's say we'll take that scenario of those 20 leaders, if there's sort of 1, 2 or 3 who were kind of feeling confident at the beginning of the session, leave still feeling confident and with a bit more knowledge, and you're really relying on 2 or 3 people to drive a strategy, because everyone else is going to do either the bare minimum, a bit of a box ticking, oh, it's the end of the month, maybe I've got a KPI that's been set, I better quickly try and do something, but ultimately you're putting everything, your reliance on a successful delivery of that on the 2 or 3 people who walked in already feeling arguably more confident than others in that subject. And I reflect on a time where I saw this work brilliantly in an organization who really sort of went for it in terms of a brave, bold strategy around increasing race and ethnicity agendas in a particular part of the world. And that group of senior leaders loved the ambition. They loved that it would set them apart in their industry. It would bring in us all those great things that we talked about in terms of talent, longevity, retention, promotion opportunities, and on and on. They loved it, and they were super proud that they got behind it. When it came to actually announcing that strategy and getting behind it, a complete shift. Because the confidence eroded. It was one thing to think, yes, this is amazing, and I'm really proud to be behind something as bold that will deliver such change. But when it came down to the 11th hour, I, as a leader, now need to announce this to my teams. I need to start getting action behind it. They lost their confidence. And the greatest thing that could have happened was supplying them with an individual coach on EDI, because each of those leaders has a different background. Each person came with different sets of worries and concerns, but some were common. And so, where it worked so nicely was giving them the investment to have 2 or 3 individual coaching sessions and coming together as a learning group to say, I was really nervous about X. So was I. They had that shared experience. Here are some things that really helped me. This is why I now understand it better, so that you have that blend of group learning as well. So, that to me was exactly, if you're going to go big, bold and hard, which is what everybody wants you to do, then it's really worth paying a bit more time and energy into providing tailored, I guess, support and coaching on something that is as nerve-wracking for leaders as this topic.
I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of short-term investment and long-term investment with EDI. So I think if you're going to launch this amazing ambition strategy, or whatever you want to call it, in the EDI space, you need to put in some resource around the leaders and making sure they feel comfortable and they are able to, may not necessarily be not leaders, but experts in all aspects of it, but feel they can talk to it and understand the importance to it, to their day-to-day, to the business. So actually, is it worth having that cost right up front? Yes, because actually, if you think about the long-term benefits that you reap from it, it's well worth it. If you don't do that, you're going to have long-term costs where you have the strategy and viewpoint around diverse talent, but yet you're not capturing it. That's going to have an impact on your performance as an organization, your innovation, how your teams work. So there is a long-term cost there. So I think there is a room for businesses, and particularly EDI practitioners, when we're developing these great EDI plans, to actually articulate there will be an upfront cost. And then almost weigh out the long-term costs as well if we don't do it this way, and actually weigh up how an organization wants to, face that cost, so to speak. Do you want to be more efficient with your money, or do you want to have a long-term cost that will grow exponentially because you're not really reaping the benefits of this amazing strategy and plan you put forward? And I think, that's just a great point to probably end this on. But actually, put resource into your EDI teams up front, and you will reap the capital investment down the line.
Exactly. It's back to that ERG method. It's back to what we've said all along, which is that this topic is a business topic. So approach an EDI strategy as you would any other business plan. Upfront investment, long-term gains. And, what better message to end on? I think we have done an appalling job of sticking to 30 minutes. So I will try and put some terrible disclaimer written at the beginning that says this is not 30 minutes, it's whatever it turned out to be. But you know what, Leo, I think we obviously, we've covered a lot of ground. We've said a lot of things. We probably could continue forever. But I hope, and I actually believe that this conversation is really useful for people who are like-minded or not. People struggling with questions and wondering what is the thing to put their energy into. Hopefully, this conversation is helpful for them.